Welcome to the HR Uprising podcast. This highly practical podcast series explores HR and management hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Brought to you by Actus software, our aim is to build a better workplace for people. The HR Uprising is about collaborating and supporting each other to build the confidence and skills to rise up to each challenge and deliver real, lasting business value. You can find out more at hruprising.com or join our LinkedIn community. Now introducing your host, chartered psychologist, best-selling author, entrepreneur and speaker, Lucinda.
Hello and welcome to the 99th episode of the HR Uprising podcast. I can hardly believe it. We are having a super duper countdown, and honestly, the guests over the next 3 weeks, I'm so excited to have them join us. So this week, the episode is all about energy, and let's face it, it really couldn't be any more appropriate, could it? As we get to the end of January and we start February, let's just hope that we all start to feel a bit more energised. And that's what we're going to talk about this week with the fantastic Perry Timms, all about the history of energy. Well, maybe not the history, but certainly how we can think about maintaining, invigorating and energising ourselves and our workforce. It was great to have Perry on. We recorded this just before Christmas, and I think you'll really enjoy this. So do tune in now for my 99th HR Uprising episode with the fantastic Perry Timms. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. This week I am joined by somebody that many people will know well. He's a very well-known influencer, communicator, and change agent, and has got one of the best job titles that I'm aware of. He is the founder and chief energy officer at People and Transformational HR Limited. I'm sure many of you have come across Perry. So Perry Timms, thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising podcast.
Thanks, Lucinda. Great to be here. We finally made it.
I know, this is it. We've talked about it remotely, haven't we? And finally got around to it. And one of the triggers for it was I was lucky enough to review your book that you've recently put out, that I've got here in front of me, The Energised Workplace. And I thought, wow, what a relevant topic for all of us, which is why I was keen to talk to you. We are actually recording this just before Christmas, just as we've announced going into I'm in tier 4, I think you're not. But just basically, we're aware that everyone's going to go back, and energy is a premium resource, isn't it? So we wanted to make this as useful as possible for people.
Great. So firstly, thanks for the review. It's nice when somebody like you as a peer gets their hands on it and can see what my intent was for it. And of course, it was all conceived prior to any of this, and it was written and finalised before it. And then it was only the tiny little edit bits you get the chance to sort of talk about it. But interestingly, in the opening sort of salvo of the book, I talked about an already existing quiet pandemic, and that was this concept of peak work, and where we are working so hard and so relentlessly that we've got nothing left. And what was concerning me was the impact on us as vessels of human energy. And I was thinking, we've done something wrong here. We've got the machinery all completely wrongly calibrated. And then the pandemic pops up and it's almost like, oh my dear, we got a proper one now.
Absolutely. And I was reflecting on it. Obviously, I appreciate you would have written it before the pandemic came along. And I look at what 2020 has been like for the HR profession. I think there's very few professions that have been more profoundly impacted. Well, okay, nursing and NHS actually, in terms of a business profession, they've had a huge amount to deal with this year, haven't they? So I imagine that certainly what we'll do as we go through some of the tips, it will be really good for people to think, actually, time for me to recharge, look after my energy, because I need to have something in the tank.
Totally.
For going forwards there. But what made you sort of passionate about this topic?
So I've got that title, as you described in the opening sequence, and it was just a little bit of play on CEO, because at the time it was just me. So I was the CEO of me, and I thought that was stupid. But one client in particular used to ask me to come in and only gave me the remit of the work on arrival into the office to work with their HR team. And after a couple of these sort of sessions with like the employee relations team or the recruitment team and stuff, I sort of said to the HR director, I said, look, I like it because it's all random and it's very in the moment. I said, but I'm just, what am I actually doing for you here? And she said, well, when you come in and then work with a team, she says their energy levels are lifted visibly for a good few weeks. And I'm like, whoa, that's what you've got me for, almost like an energizer. So that's where the energy thing came in. I've been sort of synonymous with having enthusiasm and sort of boundless energy. I remember back in the day on projects that were even getting a bit stuck and a bit, kind of slow. I was still the one going, come on, let's see what we can do, and try and cheerlead and raise people's sort of attention to what we could still do rather than stuff that we couldn't do anymore because it was on hold. So I guess I've always had this approach, and I look back on my career and thought, all the time, even when I've been facing some really tricky stuff, I've somehow found the energy reserves to get through it. And then I look at other people and think they don't. And I didn't want to judge them. I wanted to think about the system they were working in. Because the system I was working in, there was enough latitude for me to do it, but some people just don't have that. So that got me thinking the system's more wrong than people, and therefore we're not fixing people. We should fix the system to enable people to have space to regenerate their energy. I used to commute so much, and all I would see is these early starters and late arrivers who just looked exhausted every day. And I thought, that's not right. So it's kind of that sparked it, really.
So it's the words that came into mind there, things like resilience, things like change agent, positivity. Yeah. From you as a personality type, would those all be synonymous with your natural temperament?
They would. Yeah. And so I was a little bit careful not to play that, well, I can make a choice, so can you, because I just don't think it's that simple. I mean, there are some, motivational speakers out there who'll, kind of bang the Tony Robbins kind of drum and just go, it's all within you. You can do it if you want to. I don't buy that, because I think some people are trapped within a system. So I got the chance to sort of manifest all this thinking when a TEDx opportunity came up to speak, and I knew what I wanted to talk about. And I said to them, look, I'll need to do some research for this, but I want to talk about human energy at work, because that was getting to become important to me. So I did a bit of research, and I found some staggering statistics about mental ill health at work and stress-related absences costing us billions and 100 million days and stuff. I'm like, this is ridiculous. So the more I looked into it, the more I realised that most people were caged in their work and didn't get the chance to be free. And I found this concept of freedom to almost like illustrate that people can go to the edge of the known boundaries of their workplace, where there was lots of excitement and regenerative activity, but most people were still locked in the cage. So I definitely didn't want to subscribe to that happy clappy bang the tambourine and just shout yeah kind of thing. It wasn't that simple. It's people are trapped, and I need to try and help them work within the confines that they've got.
So if we've got people who are listening to this who are obviously they're in HR, and actually more than most roles, we have the opportunity to change the system potentially. Yeah. What signs, if you were to look around the organisation you're in, would people see to realise that actually they might be strapped, the culture, or they might feel trapped in that?
Yeah. One's really obvious is that people are kind of withdrawn and almost entrenched. So I get lots of my HR colleagues when I do consulting work, and even on speaking stuff, who will talk about silo working. And I'm like, okay, well, I've seen the opposite of that. I've seen very high flourishing organizations where people don't even recognize those boundaries. They cut across them, they form multidisciplinary teams and solve problems, and their energy levels are really high. So I look for that as the early sign. If people are so entrenched in finance or research or whatever it is, that's a sign that they've kind of hunkered down so much that they are not looking for collaborative cross-cutting efforts. And that worries me, because that energy cycle isn't replenished when you're just entrenched within your own discipline. So where I've seen HR teams that are, pretty good even in the face of adversity around this, it's because they are up and out, and they are off, and they are working with the tech team, and they're working with the customer team. They're not entrenched at all. So that's the first obvious sign. If you can see entrenchment, and you can kind of feel it as well as analyze it through employee engagement surveys just as one point of data, then there's the starting point of some trouble. Then, of course, there's high attrition. Then, of course, there's high levels of absence, but also look out for things like disputes, as in like disputes within teams, disputes within managerial chains. The more of those you got, the more your energy's in the wrong place.
So when you get things like bullying, harassment, or grievances and that sort of thing, then that's people putting negative energy in, which of course brings people down. You're using all that energy. Interestingly, I was thinking the HR business partner model. I'm talking to Dave Ulrich coming up actually. That
you don't have to. One of the beauties of being an HR person and learning and development, actually, I think almost more so the learning and development, is you do get that cross organizational access, don't you? So you can be the energizer, you can be that change agent. If you are an HR business partner, I guess, then the key here is making sure you don't become too native, and you are able to pepper and network with other people to make sure you break down those silos.
Totally right, and you're right to pick on those two disciplines particularly, because learning and development professionals do get to do that because they've got kind of internal clients who commission them, and HR business partners are there as this conduit between the people strategy and its operationalized elements, but then also to feed in operational intelligence back into HR to say we haven't got enough flexible work in here because these teams just cannot keep up with their workload or whatever it might be. So you're right, and therefore that intelligence source is really important because that can impact the design, and the design can then create the system, and the system can help people regenerate energy. It is simple in its sounding, but it's not in its application. And you're right, some HRBPs do tend to feel like they're too aligned to their business unit, and therefore they don't kind of play the HR strategy game, and they just bend and shape and do whatever they can for the business, which might sound right, but actually it's almost like, but you just created a sort of an offshoot enterprise that doesn't play by the same rules that everybody else does, and then you've got trouble, because when you're trying to align rewards or absence or whatever, then it's difficult. So they are an energy conduit, and learning definitely is. So one of the things I really advocate in the book is just how powerful a regenerator of energy learning is. When we learn new stuff, when we acquire new skills, when we almost force ourselves into new frontiers, energy raises.
Learning actually is an energizer, isn't it? And actually, when you've got low energy, you don't really feel like developing a new self, any of the renewal type activities or exercising, things like that. Whereas if you can maybe break the cycle and learn something new or do something new, then that tips it the other way.
Exactly.
So just going back to your example earlier about when you were working, that you were going into that organization and that she said, you are basically energizing them. What behaviors were you doing? What were you doing with them that did that? So
really what we were doing was sat down as a team and we were saying, now what are our collective challenges, like in the immediacy, right? So they were brought into a sort of, 3-5 year HR vision, and they were having to do quite a lot of adaptation because the organization was going a lot more to online, and that was having an impact on brick mortar sort of place and so on. So we were looking at all those challenges, and then they were sort of starting to articulate some business functions that were a bit dysfunctional, taking a lot of time, both in recruitment actually and in ER, and then also in learning. So we were looking a little bit forensically at those, and I was saying, well, how are we tackling them? And I was almost doing a bit of analysis on how they were running their projects, allocating their workload, and whether people were stepping into spaces that were strongly aligned to their strengths, or they were playing out of their norms, and so therefore it was a bit of a struggle. And we would reconstitute the sort of plan and the method and the approach and define goals, and then I'd take some of those team and individually chat to them and say, okay, we've agreed this kind of team charter for a while, but what about you individually? And they'd air a few things that were going on, and I'd try and help them think about what they were distracted by, where there was friction and tension, where they had some good flow, and how they could again start to reimagine, I suppose, their workload. And it was those individual ones that I think were the most lasting, because people came out of them going, I've got a plan, I didn't even know I needed one, but I've got one now. And it was that clarity of what you're up against, how good are you at doing it, and where can you get some help from? That was it.
So it's kind of coaching in many ways, without being brought in as a coach, but a kind of more kind of collaborative question. Totally. What can you do? And moving people from being, maybe when we look down, we get kind of a bit entrenched, don't we? Get stuck in what we're doing, and helping people to look up and work out where they're going forwards.
Completely. So, and the key word for me was clarity. And I see it all the time. We carry in our heads almost like our entire project work portfolio, and it doesn't make sense. So we took it out of the head and we put it into things like applications and to-do lists and a number of different variances. And we actually tried to put some measures to it as well. We were almost like, well, how long is that going to take? And it's like, I haven't even thought about it. And so I'd say to them stuff like, well, is it 2 hours work or is it 100 hours work? It's like, no, it's not 100 hours work. So what is it then? And they kind of come up with 6, and it'd be like, well, set yourself 6 hours, then you'll get it done. And they just felt more in control of their work because they'd defined, they'd almost atomized it. Yeah,
and you're taking away that overwhelm, and you've got your to-do list and you're kind of going, oh my word, I've got so much to do, and you're not quite sure. If you can work it down, chunk it down, then it's all more achievable, and then you've got freedom around it, and you feel it's achievable. It's all in your head, but actually you feel completely different to it.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So those, those are really useful things for any of us to think about. If we're feeling a bit overwhelmed, we're feeling a bit low energy, break things down, work out what can I do, how do I chunk it down, and how much time will it do? All those sort of things. It's really practical, but actually energizing.
I do quite a bit of sort of mentoring and even some career coaching within it for people. I mean, I love to do that because there are so many good professionals out there. I want to help where I can, but also I get great inbound. So I feel like I'm in touch with the real world as part of what I do as a consultant. And often they have unclear career ambitions. And all we do is we start writing them down, putting names to them, starting to think about activities that explore them. And all of a sudden it's like there's an epiphany. And they're so then energized towards an option that they didn't know they had. And it's like, I don't think I did anything. All I did was just let you talk it out and define it. But it's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, maybe that's something because if you've got someone who's a standalone HR, probably they're expected to do that for everybody in their organization, but they are not necessarily getting anyone to do that for them. So whether they can get a mentor or whether we can get a buddy and buddy up with other people and say, well, what do I want to do, and crystallize it, then that is again engaging.
I'm a big believer in that the more you can pair up with people in specifics rather than general terms, the more you've got somebody who you can chat to, who can help you make sense, who can be a critical friend, who can challenge. And all of those things just stop it whirring around in your head, never going anywhere. You kind of land them when you start talking them out and you start to write them down. And I've known people do stuff like mood boards off the back of that. So they go and cut up bits of magazine and they create a mood board and they pin it somewhere and have a look at it when they're kind of thinking, what am I up to? I'm after that. Suddenly it changes their whole frame of energy because they realize what they're doing is in pursuit of something they want.
I mean, that's an interesting one because I've been doing a bit of this sort of gratitudes in the morning. I've been listening to that during the lockdown, and I have to say the whole way in which we can tweak our thinking and our mindset, it makes a massive difference to your well-being, doesn't it? And that's essentially what you're doing with the mood board, isn't it? Looking at something that you want. Totally and reshaping, changing your shape, so changing your state, I guess, and changing your thoughts there. And again, I think HR professionals quite often are having to deal with some of the negative stuff. So it's being able to flip your mood. Again, we're both got more of an L&D OD background, and I always felt that is easier to do. We get the nice bit of HR, if you like, whereas and it's much more future and can be much more exciting, whereas a lot of HR professionals are having to deal with a lot of the most difficult stuff, whether it's well-being issues or whether it's grievances, all of those type things. So again, being able to flip your mental thinking, reshape, change your state is quite key, isn't it? And changing your thinking there.
It's interesting in the book that I deliberately didn't go into positive psychology or resilience, and that's not an omission. That was deliberate. What I wanted to do was make sure this was about the system that people are operating in, not individuals. There are lots of things people can do individually about things, but I wanted to make sure that the blame was put on system, not individual. So people saying you haven't got that in there, I'm like, I know, I did. It didn't feel right to put it in there. So I'm not trying to create the the kind of the resolution to sit with individuals. Is, but not through just a little bit of stacking something in to get through a really tricky operating system. It's like, well, let's try and fix the system, and then I'll be able to use all those tools better for me.
And then you fix it for more people, basically, as well, don't you? Because we are all part of that system. So in terms of that, then talk to me a bit about the system. What are the problems that you'd see predominantly?
So the first one I think is role design, and I think there's just something about the cut and paste nature, and it quite literally is. And I've said on record before, it drives me nuts. I see it. I'm in HR groups, and I see some professionals post in that and say, "Has anybody got a job description for an admin assistant on a help desk? Because I want to cut and paste it." I'm like, that's a crime, because you can't be bothered to think about what's needed in your context. You just want to lift and shift somebody else's, and then expect them to come alive with that. I think that's awful. So there are things like that. I want to see us go intricately into design. Say, look, when you come into a role, you don't know what this role is all about, but after a while, you will. We're going to give you enough to get you going, but then we want you to have the ability to shape that role as you start to discover where you're best and what this role needs to have the most impact. So I wanted to look at that. So job role, definitely. And I love stuff like Rob Baker's job crafting. I think that's just genius. And so then I wanted to look at the system that those roles operate in. And that's both at a team level, but more at the kind of construct of organizational sort of functions. And I wanted to think about how could we do it differently. So again, I avoided going cliched and just saying agile's the answer, let's just do that. I mean, it's part of it, don't get me wrong. I wanted to look at the whole thing. I wanted to look at how we can think about where are people best, and use that as a design factor, because I think we just slot people into these kind of generic holes, and I'm like, people aren't like that we waste I don't know how much talent by people having a job description that doesn't include something they're often brilliant at. So I'm like, how can we get over that? Well, we design it from humans out. and that's the perhaps big and controversial thing.
You do that in an SME a bit, because you basically you have who you've got, and you go, right, okay, so they also have, they might be in marketing, but they also have to be particularly good at this. How can I get value out of that person in that organization? It's been that whole person. I mean, it goes both ways, but maybe larger organizations, you're more pigeonholed, maybe.
And there's a warning there in that a lot of the high levels of stress, I mean, entrepreneurs, as an example, almost seem to thrive on doing 60, 70 hours. They're almost like, no, I want to do that. That's why I stepped into this space, because I'm doing it for me. I'm not doing it for the man. But big organizations almost get that, but people are doing it reluctantly, because I think it's just the forced way of being. So therefore, there is something about how can we avoid that? Now, big organizations are made up of micro enterprises, and it's almost like, well, take that design concept and just put it into the micro and just see what you can do around it. I don't buy that managers are completely helpless about the construct of their team. No. They're not. They can change it, but they don't know how. And that's where we can come in within HR and OD, because we can help them. We can help them recalibrate within. It doesn't mean a total disruption. It just means you look at all the work you've got and you say, who are we and how can we best tackle all this? And then people get involved in the co-creation process. There's this thing called the IKEA effect, isn't there, where you love what you build. That's what I want to see people do more.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, obviously, you are absolutely, as a manager, if you focus on your people first, if you know your people and what their passions are, and your point about entrepreneurs, it's often because they're passionate about what they do, so it doesn't all feel like work. So if you can get to people's passions in an organization, and it is interesting you're saying it's about the system, it's almost, but it's about the people within the system is really what you're focusing on, isn't it? It's very much about the individual talents, but finding a way for them to be utilized. And
what I've realized is the system is needed to get you going, because there is a sense of like familiarity and comfort and understanding where you're at, your climate, let's call it your climate. And that needs some system parameters like protocols, but I love principles. So in the organization I've got, there's only 8 of us, but we adopt a lot of principles, and they really hold us firm on things we don't want to, kind of fall foul of. After that, anything we do system wise is down to the people, like you say, testing, discovering, adapting and shifting. So we've just constituted some team agreements so that we understand how we can rely on each other. And it's that level that bonds you as a team, and you understand how you appreciate each other and what you do. And then we make sure we align ourselves both in learning and then in our expertise. It kind of emerges. So Kirsten on the team, as an example, has got a real passion for sustainability. So she leads on our impact, and our impact includes client work inside the organization, but also what we do for the planet. So that's almost just lining somebody up with a passion they've already got.
So if you've got, is that one of your principles, sustainability?
Yeah. So we want to operate in not just an offset, but a carbon positive way. Yeah.
So, how would you say principles are differing from values for you?
They're not that different. I think you almost have principles and they can manifest themselves in one or more values. So for example, we have a principle that we won't sell to anybody, but we'll be, unabridged enthusiasts, and we want people to know that and come to us. And so that would be, you could manifest that in a value that will be, client centric, or, content first, or we won't spam people on emails, or whatever it is. So there are values, I think, that come out of your principles, but I almost think your principles are easier to agree, and then you can manifest them as a short series of statements that are your values. We haven't really got values, but we really strongly believe in principles.
Yeah, and I can see there would be an overlap there in terms of those. And then you talk about your team agreement. What would give some examples of that? Because these sound like useful things that people can do for themselves as well.
Very much so. Team agreements are brilliant. So, for example, in an internal meeting, if we're booking each other in, we'll be considerate to things like we've got 3 working mums. So we'll be considerate of the times they're on and off. And if we have to bail out of one, we'll give people loads of notice, and we will not turn up to each other's own internal things. So it's just principles like that. And I think, sort of we want people to opt into work. So if there's a new piece of work, we declare the work is in, and how we select people to do it firstly is on people who say, I'd really like to get involved in that, whether I've got the experience or not. So it's those kind of things that we've agreed on, and they really do make a difference, because people feel like it's a charter that's been constructed by everybody, not just enforced.
And I guess that in itself is also energizing, isn't it? Because you're feeling valued, you feel, oh yeah, I'm excited about what you're doing, and you've got opportunities. It's very much future, isn't it? It's in terms of exploration of opportunities.
And it's easier to deal with the negative energy too. So if somebody is not on duty and doesn't check in, and therefore you kind of think, oh, that's a bit odd, you feel like, because it's in the team agreement, you can have the conversation without it feeling like it's a bit nasty and it kind of creates that horrible energy vibe. It's just like, there's a reason that we want to know that you're around, because we want to know you're safe, and we want to you want you to feel included even remotely. So we've instilled these sort of daily check-ins, and so it makes what could be an awkward conversation not a kind of fragmenting or fracturing conversation. It's all about actually bonding and binding. And it just makes the outcome for that a lot easier. And people actually come away from it thinking, that wasn't tough. I stood by a principle and I got it across to somebody in a way that they felt comforted by rather than challenged.
So you said then, you talked about a daily check-in. That's something you do to check in with everybody, but they know the purpose of it is to check in on your well-being and your energy, as opposed to a presenteeism, which totally. I think I want to go into I do want to go into the tips thing, and also I just want to explore briefly sort of the spiritual aspect of it, because there was some, I was like, hang on, we're talking about chakras and things like that. I'd be keen to talk about that, but just before we go there, the whole home working thing and the Zoom culture, I mean, that has been fascinating. When we started out right in the Easter, everybody seemed like had loads of time, and then all of a sudden feels like everyone's their energy's gone, but everyone's just got they're online all the time. I don't know, what's your observations about home working and managing energy?
So what I think we've done is we have missed out with what I would call spontaneous triggers. So, and we've replaced them with formal, almost like disciplines. So, if you and I worked in the same physical space, I'd just pop over to you, sit by your desk, we'd have a little chat, and we'd talk about an issue where we needed to resolve it. But because we can't do that, we've booked a formal check-in that lasts half an hour. And actually we kind of fill that half an hour, whether we like it or not sometimes. And it's just like, it's another punishing schedule. So I don't like what we've done there. Now, there are some alternatives, right? So since even writing the book, I've seen a system operate in a tech company where people can block out some time in their calendar and just say, look, if you need to talk to me, here's the link to Google Meet, just pop in, because I'm interruptible. And it's almost replacing the kind of sit by the desk or knock on the door thing. And now I've seen a piece of workplace software, which is virtual workplace software, where you have an avatar with a green ring round it if you're accessible, and a red one if you're on a call. So I can literally pop into your office. I think we need to replicate more of those, because they're the little energy sparks that we're missing out on. So we're at a punishing schedule. And even if we didn't feel it, it would come across as punishing, because there's no gaps, there's no keyword punctuation. So so some of those things can work, where you just make yourself available informally, less formally. I think that's where we've got it wrong, and I'll hopefully see 2021 starting to correct some of that, because there's no need to do it. And then things like all hands and kind of briefings and learning events, if anything's over 3 hours, forget it. I mean, that's the tolerance. We deliberately make sure everything's 3 hours if we're in a learning environment with people, because anything more than that is just, it kills you.
You might be able to you can manage a full day's training course when you're face to face with people, can't you? You can maintain energy there, but you just can't do it online.
Nah, it's nuts. And you're right, the energy is just, it's zapped almost from the thought of it. So what I found is some of our 3-day labs that we've brought in, actually, you get to the sort of 2 hours 45 and think, blimey, that's gone by really quick. I mean, you're still quite tired because of the concentration and the dialogue, and because we're not in person, we sort of fill in verbally what we would have normally done physically. But at the end of it, if it's gone quick, you're like, well, that must be all right.
Get the interaction going. I mean, I've learned those sorts of things a bit. I think it's amazing how much you can achieve virtually online, but it's not entirely the same. It's not a complete move on. So using that, and I think in order to make the most of the informal check-in, whether it's Teams or whatever people use, we do have to therefore manage our presence. But we also probably need to manage our space then to make sure that we're not back to back in meetings, so that we therefore do have the energy for someone to knock on your office door and metaphorically and have access to you. Otherwise, I think people end up sitting with their not available all day because they're just trying to get on with stuff because they're in so many meetings.
Yeah, that feels a little bit weird and almost inculcates the isolation. So I've rarely liked it when that happens. I mean, short messaging, whether it's on Slack or WhatsApp or whatever, has been a godsend because the team and I are in all different parts of the UK and world, and actually the short messaging format has really kept us together. So we've tried to do that. We've also experimented with, and again, this came out since, and so it isn't in the book, asynchronous meetings where we record a bit of video, send it on to somebody, they record a response, send it back to us, then we consume the meeting in a dispersed sense without having to connect in for half an hour, and that's quite cool. That's like 5 minutes each instead of 30 minutes of conversation, but we still get the same exchange. So we try.
Does that work? I can't imagine how does that actually you get the information you need, because you're not getting the backwards and forwards. It's out of it's asynchronous.
Because I think half of meeting time is often a brief and an understanding. So you get that bit over, then you get a reaction, and then you think, right, we just need 5 minutes then to explore that 2.1 thing that hasn't quite worked out. And then we come together and do that. So we're kind of thinking, oh, that's a good way of saving effort. We did that mainly because people were on different time
zones. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's a good idea.
So just that stops you having meeting after meeting after meeting, because you can video it and ping it off and then get it, watch it when you want. And I've started to do it with clients. So instead of clients having to spend hours on the phone to me or whatever, I've said, just record me an audio file and I'll play it back. And it's saved them no end of time, and they love it now. So some of them, that's how they interact with me. They send me an audio file saying, here's the issue, I want your thoughts.
Great. Another good way of thinking about things, and actually a different way of working. I'm not. It's not quite the same thing as me overusing Siri. That I was in Harry. I do all my texts and stuff and WhatsApps and Skypes, because we use Skype a lot on Siri, which is loads quicker, and I'm very impatient. But you do get some fairly terrible typos if you don't read it back properly. So tell me a little bit about the spiritual bit of this. I was intrigued by this. Yeah, so the more I spoke to people, the more I got the sense that we need something to hang it on, and we need something that validates this, because we do talk about energy and depletion and spirit and all that kind of stuff, but we don't have anything to hang it on. So I knew of chakras. I'm not a yoga practitioner at all, but I knew of them. And it was the story in the book about the Russian athletes who were measured by this quantum measuring resource, and I thought, this is incredible. But it got me thinking that we are energy vessels. There are sparks going through our brain that turn into thoughts. So I'm thinking, oh, how can I put some of this in? And in fact, the publisher was a little bit reluctant to have this in the book, and I had to hold it and say, well, you published a whole book on. It's not a typical Kogan page, is it?
Nah. And so I stuck to my guns, and they allowed it in, as long as I made it a little bit more kind of business context, I suppose. But this is why we're seeing things like yoga being introduced into the workplace, and mindfulness and retreats and all that kind of stuff. Now, the chakras and the energy sources, whether I believe how they're defined is how we are, or whether it's a very nice interpretation like psychometrics, I thought, well, it's no less hooky than MBTI, so let's give it a go. And actually, the more I read into it, the more I looked at it, the more I thought, blimey, there is something in this. There is something in understanding perhaps the gut feeling and the kind of overwhelm mentally. Kind of thing. So I just wanted to lay it out there and go, we've got some tools that help us understand the flow of energy through us and from us, and just hopefully spark some people into further exploration of that.
Yeah, I mean, and energy is this unspoken thing, isn't it? It's hard to conceptualize. So a different way of looking at it. I thought it's good for you for getting that into a code page. So I suppose it's great talking to you, Perry. Again, in terms of practical tips, so for people listening, if we were to round into those, you've got your tools for the next 20 years. Oh, before I go into the practical tips, because we'll kind of go on to that and conclude on that bit. But the 20 theme that's through that, was that because it was 2020, or was there something?
Well, it was interesting because this is when I was conceptualizing the TEDx talk into the book, and I was trying to think, how do you make 18 minutes into something that's worth reading 200 plus pages of? And I started to sketch stuff out, and it started to come that 20 appeared quite a lot, because I was interested in Pareto, and whether 80% of our performance at work is determined by 20% of our energy, or the other way around.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of that going on, and I just had to play with it a bit to kind of get as a theme throughout. Yeah, and in the end, it was good because it kind of stuck me to a discipline, like you say, about a kind of an amorphous concept.
Yeah, it gives it a theme. It hangs it together. Every chapter, for listeners, if you're not aware of Perry's book, The Energized Workplace, it's got 20 in it in some form, hasn't it, basically?
Yeah.
So go on then, tell us a bit about tools and tips for people.
Okay. So I think one of the first things to start to think about is, describing yourself as an energy source and how you come alive. I suppose that's the thing. So often now when I'm coaching people, the first thing I ask them is, tell me about a time when you came to life and what was going on and how your energy felt with that. And then use that, keep coming back to that. So almost like paint yourself the pen picture of when you are at your flourishing best, and somehow keep that in mind, because that's your North Star. That's where you want to be as much as you can. But if we don't define it, we won't know it. Knowing it makes a difference to how you feel about your energy. Then that leads you on to the next thing, which is to understand your cadence or your rhythm. And by that, I mean things like, I am better in the mornings for complex drafting and creative thought. So if I've got something to do and it's 6:30 in the evening, I'm like,
no chance. Leave it till 6:30 in the morning.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Like, you know what? I've even got up at 4 a.m. because I just want to do it, and I've loved it. Great. So know your energy cadence and your rhythm, so that you sign yourself up to things that are in the flow of who you are and how you are. That's the second tip. Then the third tip is start to think about energy as a daily resource of yours, and to map out what you think your energy is going to be challenged by in the day you have facing you, so that you can kind of think, oh, I've got this tricky thing in the afternoon. I'm going to need to, get myself sparked up for that. So therefore, what I'm going to do in the middle of the day, I'm going to do something that I know is good for me, learning, drawing, whatever, and I'll go into that and I'll feel totally different. And believe me, that works. So map your energy out. Then the other tip is to then journal your energy on a daily or weekly basis, so that you are aware of what's pulling at your energy and draining it, and what's giving you some energy. And then start thinking, I do too much depletion, not enough regeneration. So it's like, we'll program some in there. Do you know, we quite literally schedule in something that gives you a lift. That may be a person, it may be a thing, but be deliberate about that. And then the other thing I think is so crucial is that thing I said I did with the team, which is to atomize your work, so you know how much time and effort you've got to put into certain things, so that you time box, work size, whatever you want to call it, but do not go into every day not knowing how many hours worth of work you have got on your plate that day to do. I think the worst thing in lockdown has been this constant sense of never finishing. That's not a good place to be.
Yes, because you're not necessarily getting the closure, are you, on things potentially? You don't walk away from. Well, you have to consciously do that, whether it's a conscious commute down the drive, or out with the dogs, or especially people who are working in their bedrooms or their kitchens or something. You've really got to do something to.
And then those physical things, like you say, so walking meetings and those kind of things. I mean, I don't tend to do so much of those, but I do give myself some decompression, some escape, and whatever it might be. But whether you're physical or mental on that one is down to you. So know that a punctuation in terms of exercise or whatever is going to be a good thing for you to do.
Definitely. It's links to years ago I used to train on the 7 habits, and Covey would talk about renewal, sharpen the saw, basically, and there were 4 areas of it. So physical, spiritual, emotional, and one that I've now forgotten. But it's basically this a similar model, but knowing. So not just renewing in one way. Actually, is it about learning, or social's the other one that I've forgotten there. But I think that's really helpful stuff that we can all think of, that perhaps people are not aware of. And it's actually taking a step back to consciously think about it, because often when our energy levels are at the lowest, that we don't actually feel able to take a step and think, okay, what do I need to do here? It's a
conscious spiral of almost like absence. So you're right, when we don't feel like it, we pay less attention to it, then we get more tired and more tired, then it gets harder to do. That's partly why I wanted to come up with those energy quotient things, to spend 20 minutes just looking at one of those things, to think, could that regenerate me even a little bit, and pay attention to those. So whether that's learning or experimenting or socially connecting, whatever it is, these things are so important to us that we haven't programmed them into our schedules and days. ways. I don't mean to over formalize them, but just to give you those little boosts and those little nudges and so on. Yeah, definitely.
But it's having the awareness of what those things are. So again, and this, you can tie this into mental health, because when your mental health is declining, then you're less likely to reach out to, let's say, having a chat with your best mate. You might go, I haven't got the energy to do it now, or whatever. So making sure that we do just keep on recharging, conscious recharge.
The more stressed we are, the more we socially withdraw, when actually that's the opposite of what we really need, which is more help, more touch points, more stimulus. And it just seems to be a contra reaction. But I think it obviously comes from, the sort of psychological makeup of us trying to protect ourselves in times of real danger. But this is not like the same kind of danger, is it? It's more a constructed thing where we need other people to help us get through it, but we withdraw and seek it less.
And we can therefore we can reach out to other people, and going back to making this systemic in our organisations, we can try to provide opportunities for people to have that support.
Totally. So whether it's a learning pair, whether it's a well-being pair, whatever it is, I think the more we pair up, the more we're likely to create this kind of networked effect around us that we get a lot from when we help other people and they help us, so they get a kick too. That stuff is really good for regeneration.
Yeah, trying to almost formalize matrices and things in an organisation, particularly if we're going to continue being virtual, which likelihood is. So how can we help support those sort of pairings up, those cross-functional relations that we can actually support each other?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, so Perry, what are you going to do to energize yourself today?
Yes. So apart from this, obviously I was really looking forward to this, so I felt pretty pumped about that. I've got a lovely interview for somebody who's writing a book about workplace psychology, so that's going to spark me into action. She sent me the questions already, and I've done a little bit of a download so that I know I want to be coherent with it, but I know it's going to spark me into all sorts of ways. And then just a couple of client calls, so that one with a not-profit, which might be nice. I get a lot of energy working in the not-profit area, and I am genuinely starting to think now about what I can do for the rest of my time in the festive break. I'm really looking forward to not being like on duty and just picking and choosing where I let my energy go. And I've got a stack of books to read, and I love doing that.
Fantastic. That sounds great. Well, you've totally inspired me. I've got to say, I feel energized from this conversation, Perry. It's really great. Thank you. And so practical. And one thing I think, just to close on, because of how you've triggered questions that's made me think about this and think, right, what am I going to do about that? And I was feeling a bit tired this morning, actually, because I didn't sleep brilliantly last night. So this is great. So I think, what can I do to recharge and re-energize there? And I was just thinking also, if people know what their values are, the principles thing, I think I get energized, yes, by talking about something like that, possibilities, but also with clients, if you feel like you're making a difference, and that's one of my values. So there must be a link there. If we know what our values are, then we'll be more energized as well, if we can help people as well.
And your sense of achievement on the journey towards those values, I think, is more important than we've given it credit for. So I think company values, we've kind of created just this almost like, smoke screen of what we're here to do, whereas actually your own values and your own sense of achievement towards them is a really recyclical, energizing factor. You're like, oh, I did that, and it's in line with my values. I feel good about that. I've made a difference, as you say. And then it's almost like, what else can I do with that now?
Yeah, re-energizing. Fantastic. Thank you, Perry. You've been really generous with your time. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming on the podcast. I'll put links in there to your TED Talk or TEDx Talk and various other things. If people want to get hold of you, obviously you can find you on LinkedIn.
Exactly. Yeah, LinkedIn, Twitter, I blog on Medium, those kind of things, and the website pthr.co.uk. Not difficult to find me.
Brilliant stuff. And I'll put all of the links in the show notes.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Perry.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising, proudly brought to you by Actus Software, the joined-up performance and talent management solution. You can access links to any of the information or resources mentioned in the show via the podcast page at www.hruprising.com. If you like what we do, please subscribe, tell your colleagues, and leave a review. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising.